Welcome to Coffee College. This is Omid G, the coffee professor. We're going to talk about acidity today in coffee and what that means and why you should care and how it gets there. Acidity is often called vibrancy. It's these flavors that jump out of coffee that are maybe tangy, fruity, floral, something like that. For those of you who like coffees that are maybe like what they call the really dark roasted, the really earthy, the really peaty type of coffees, then that also means you're not a big fan of acidity. It means you like those more earthy flavors and you like the more low acid type of flavors. So if you drink a coffee that has flavors of fruit, for instance, it can be stone fruit, peaches, cherries, nectarines, apricot, or it can be more berries like a blueberry or something like that, or a strawberry sort of flavor. Or you might have something that has a floral type flavor. Might be hard for somebody to believe, but there's coffees. Like, for instance, I have a Panama natural process geisha that tastes like a meadow. It tastes like a flower bouquet. It's overwhelming. I can't even drink it. Then coffees that have overwhelming fruit flavors, some that have blueberry flavors, things like that. This all comes from acidity. Which coffees have low acidity? It would be almost anything out of Indonesia because they generally do a wet hulled process that just gets rid of all the acidity. Anything from Brazil has very low acidity because they have low elevation. Then also because they grow in full sun. I'll explain all of that in a minute. Indian monsoon Malabar coffees have very, very low acidity. I had mentioned in another video that it's a exactly neutral pH. And then the Robusta species of coffee, or Canephora, has very low acidity. So if you like low acidity, if you've got stomach acid problems, those are the kind of coffees to look at. Now, how does acidity form in coffee? The way you want to think about this is that there's several factors. One is it forms as a consequence of the variety of the bean, the cultivar. So it's not enough just to say, oh, it's an Arabica bean. Arabica has a million different varieties or cultivars. And for instance, Kenya, which is probably, in my opinion, the most acidic bean on earth, Kenya has a variety called SL28. And SL28, they have SL28 and SL34, two of their most common varieties. SL28 a little bit being the more prized of the two. It's famous for its acidity. And that acidity, the SL stands for Scott's Lab, and they developed that. That acidity creates vibrancy. It can create tartness. It can have citrus-like flavors. That's one thing that can drive it, is the variety of the bean itself. Another thing that can drive the acidity is the elevation of the bean. Now, keep in mind that coffee, in almost every case, the only country I can think of that doesn't do this is Brazil. In almost every case, coffee is grown on a mountainside. And so when you grow it on a mountainside, that means a couple of things. Well, let's stick with what I first wanted to talk about, which is elevation. The higher the elevation of the bean, then the more it cools down at night. And the more it cools down at night, the more the growth of the bean is slowed down. It only makes sense. If you have something in warmer temperatures all the time, some sort of fruiting plant, it's going to grow faster. And so that elevation slows down the growth. Now, what happens when the growth is slowed down? When the growth is slowed down, then the bean grows slower, the growing season is longer, and then that helps it develop maturity of flavors and complexity of flavors, and ultimately helps it with the development of acidity. So that's one factor, is with elevation. Yet another factor, and most beans are grown at, or let me say it differently, the best beans are grown at high elevation. So some of the highest elevation areas I've seen beans grown, I would say the Guji area of Ethiopia is pretty high. Yemen grows beans pretty high. Parts of Central or South America might grow it high. Where do they grow it low? They grow it low in Brazil, in India. And sure enough, Indian beans in general, not just the monsoon Malabars, they're not very acidic at all. Um, so elevation is a factor. Another one is shade grown versus sun grown. And that's a huge factor. So if you think about it, if you're growing on a mountainside, chances are your plants aren't going to be in full sun all day long. It's, after all, the sun moves. Well, the earth moves, but we say the sun moves, right? And eventually, either in the morning or in the afternoon, it's going to be in full shade. And being in full shade does the same thing as high elevation, which is it slows down the growth of the bean. And when you slow down the growth of the bean, then it develops those more complexity of flavors, and it has an opportunity to develop acidity. Whereas if you take someplace like Brazil, Brazil is the only country I know of, it's the only country I can think of that grows on plateaus rather than on mountainsides. And when you grow on a plateau, which, by the way, allows them to do mechanical picking because they take these huge machines through it and it picks all the beans. You can't do that on a mountainside. The machine would fall off the cliff, fall off the mountain. So that might be why they grow it on plateaus. I'm not sure. But they grow it on plateaus. And what that means is it's in full sun 100% of the day. And then it's also not a very high elevation coffee, usually not more than 1,100 meters maximum above sea level. And I consider high elevation anything above 1,400. Anything above 1,400, you're going to get really good acidity. In that Guji area of Ethiopia I mentioned, you're going to get as much as 2,200 meters, which is just unbelievable. In any event, so the shade grown makes a big deal. And so when you're on a mountainside, you're going to have at least, close to half the day in shade grown. Now, some countries take it further. And what they do is they'll intersperse coffee plants with other trees with the intent of two things. The first intent is economical, which is to maximize the farming output of their property. So if you can grow coffee and banana trees, together, or coffee and avocado trees, which is, by the way, what's happening in San Diego County and is Southern California in general. There's more than 55 coffee farms, and a bunch of them are converted avocado farms where you can keep the avocado trees and still produce those, but in between them put coffee. And how wonderful is that? Now suddenly you've created much more output from the same piece of land, much more farming output without having to buy more land. And your coffee product is better than if you had just planted it alone, because then in Southern California, it would be in full sun. You're not planting it on a mountainside, chances are. So some countries create deliberate strategies. So the first reason was economic. The second reason was to create a better coffee output. The one country that comes to mind is India. India, while they may not have high elevation, they are very deliberate about making their coffee shade grown 100% of the time. So that means it's not just in the shade part of the day, it's in the shade 100% of the day. And then of course all night, since there's no sun. So the growth of those beans is really slow. As a consequence, those are the most dense beans in the world. They're hard to penetrate. When I say penetrate, I don't mean with the tool. I mean in the roasting process, they're hard to penetrate. And so you have to hit them with a lot of heat. So those are some of the ways in which that acidity and vibrancy develops. Now, there's yet another way, and that's how you process the bean. So for instance, Kenya, which I indicated is probably the most acidic bean on earth, and it's prized for that reason, they do another thing, which is, well, what pretty much everybody does with washed process coffees is after it's mechanically depulped, and that's all Kenya does is wash process. They don't do honey process, natural process. I've never seen anything but wash process out of Kenya. They put them in fermentation tanks, and that's to help get the mucilage off and things like that. But in their case, they put it in there for a longer period of time than any other country does for wash process. And that further develops the type of acidity that you're getting. So they make it even more acidic in that way by putting in the fermentation tanks for longer. Another way I wasn't really going to get into that you can create acidity is through the anaerobic process, but I'll make that a separate video that we'll talk about. Now, there's still more criteria that leads to acidity in beans. Another one is how close you are to the equator. In the example of Colombia, they're so close to the equator. I think they're on the equator. They're the only country that I know of in the world that has 2 harvests a year. They harvest coffee twice a year. In other words, they're so close to the equator, getting so much sun, that the coffee bean grows really fast, really fast, and it develops quickly. It doesn't have an opportunity to really get a lot of acidity, and they'll have 2 harvests in a year. So 2x the amount, but which is nice from a farming output perspective. And sure enough, they produce a lot of coffee, but it doesn't allow it to get acidity. And I'm not sure why Colombian beans have such an incredible perception in the marketplace. They're fairly ordinary, and I think that's, you can get good Colombian beans, but you're hard pressed to find something incredible out of Colombia, and that's probably one of the reasons why. Yet another reason how that develops the acidity in beans is the dirt, and the dirt makes a big difference. So, for instance, in India, the dirt is not conducive to acidity. It's not volcanic soil. The countries that tend to have the most vibrant, acidic, sort of flavorful coffee are going to be almost always include the countries that have volcanic soil. So you're growing on the side of a mountain. On the side of a volcano, hopefully an extinct volcano, although there is a place, Mount Ijen in Indonesia, I sometimes get coffee from. They're growing on an active volcano, and it's spewing constantly. You talk about a high danger occupation. Go pick coffee on Mount Ijen. You're liable to die on any particular day you're working. And so the acidity that comes with the fertile soil from volcanic regions is just, you cannot match it. So if you take the best beans, the most acidic, vibrant beans in the world come from high elevation, of volcanic soil, and then usually it's on a mountain, in fact, always. And so then you're at least getting partially shade grown. Those factors just make for incredible coffee. And then the water can play a role, but it's probably less than any of the other factors I sort of mentioned. But if it's natural water coming from the ground, as opposed to coming from, I don't know where else, then it's liable to potentially have certain acids and things like that contribute. So those are all the factors that give you acidity. It'll sparkle in your cup. It'll give that tangy flavor, and either floral or fruit or something like that. And it's one of those things that either you like it or you don't. Now, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing either. So you can have, I like to balance. So I might put, for instance, a Brazilian coffee mixed with an Ethiopian, and then some Robusta too. So the Robusta for the crema, the Ethiopian for the vibrancy, and then the Brazilian for sort of a base, and a low acid base that can carry those flavors and also produce lots of crema. So those are all, those are the things you can play with. When you take what is naturally an acidic bean and you do a natural process, meaning you dried in the cherry out in the sun, then you tend to suppress the acidity some, just as a consequence of how the natural process reduces that acidity and introduces flavors from the cherry through the parchment layer and into the bean itself. I have a separate video on natural process you should watch. So I hope this was an educational segment. If you like acidity, those are the factors to contribute to it. You should always look to see what elevation were the beans grown at, where was it grown at, learn more about the origin, and then you'll know. These are all the things that contribute towards a sparkling cup of coffee, a vibrant, flavorful cup of coffee. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like, comment, share, subscribe. I'm Omid G, the Coffee Professor, and we'll see you next time.